The year was 1920. America was stepping into what many called the modern age. The streets of its cities hummed with the growl of automobiles, their shiny chrome and rattling engines replacing the quiet clop of horse hooves. Electric street lamps glowed against brick and stone buildings, casting new light over a nation eager to reinvent itself. Jazz spilled from the doors of smoky clubs. Young people danced the Charleston in sequined dresses, and newspapers spoke of prosperity and progress. But for Black Americans, this glittering promise of the Roaring Twenties was a stage with two very different sets, one in the spotlight, the other in the shadows. In New York's Harlem, the nights pulsed with something almost magical. Here, the Harlem Renaissance was blooming. Hughes was writing poetry that spoke to the soul of a people. Duke Ellington's orchestra made the air itself vibrate, and painters captured the dignity, beauty, and complexity of Black life. Harlem was alive, confident, and proud. It was a place where African Americans could walk down Lenox Avenue and feel part of a story they themselves were writing. But Harlem was also crowded, tenements stacked with families, rents high, and job opportunities uneven. The beauty of the culture didn't erase the reality of economic struggle. Outside of places like Harlem, in cities across the country, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Black families were arriving daily as part of the Great Migration. They came from the rural South, fleeing sharecropping's endless debt, escaping the daily threat of racial violence, and searching for something better. Train cars rattled northward, carrying mothers with small children, fathers clutching worn suitcases, and the hope that maybe here they would finally be free to dream. But even in the industrial cities, the promise of equality often ended at the factory gates. Black workers were given the hardest, dirtiest jobs for the lowest pay. Skilled Black tradesmen were told their abilities weren't needed. White labor unions barred them from membership, and whites-only signs marked restaurants, hotels, and even some hospitals. In the South, the story was harsher still. The year 1920 found Jim Crow laws alive and unyielding, segregated schools with hand-me-down textbooks, courtrooms where justice bent easily toward white defendants, and trains where Black passengers were forced into the colored car, no matter their ticket. Public schools for Black children were often one-room shacks with leaky roofs, overcrowded benches, and teachers paid a fraction of white educators' wages. Yet those classrooms were also places of determination. Teachers instilled not just reading and arithmetic, but pride, resilience, and a deep understanding that education was a form of liberation. Transportation in Black America carried its own story. In the cities, bicycles were affordable. Freedom young men pedaled to factory shifts before dawn, while boys delivered newspapers across bustling neighborhoods. For the few who could afford a car, driving meant a new kind of independence, but also new dangers. There were roads in America where a Black driver could be pulled over, beaten, or worse, for no reason other than their skin color. And yet, people drove anyway, because movement meant possibility. Electricity was slowly reaching more Black neighborhoods in northern cities. But in rural southern communities, kerosene lamps still lit most homes. Hospitals told a similar story. In many towns, Black patients were either denied entry to white hospitals or sent to segregated wards with fewer beds and outdated equipment. Black doctors and nurses worked tirelessly in their own small clinics, often with limited resources but boundless commitment to their patients. In these spaces, healing was more than medicine, it was community, care, and dignity. Culturally, the 1920s were a paradox. Black Americans were influencing the nation's music, fashion, and art at a scale never seen before. Jazz and blues crossed into white audiences' ears, though often stripped of the credit due to their Black creators. Dances like the Lindy Hop, born in Black communities, began to spread nationwide. But beyond the clubs and stages, racism still ruled in law and in practice. White newspapers might celebrate a Black musician's genius in one column and in another print a defense of segregation. And then there was the ever-present threat of racial violence. The decade opened just 1 year after the Red Summer of 1919, when race riots erupted in more than 24 cities. leaving hundreds of black men, women, and children dead. The wounds from those attacks were still fresh. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district, known as Black Wall Street, for its thriving business. Yet, in spite of all this, there was pride. Pride in Sunday church services, where hymns rose like defiant prayers. In black-owned barbershops and beauty parlors, where news and hope were exchanged. In schools where children recited poems about freedom, and in the simple act of wearing one's best clothes to walk downtown on a Saturday afternoon. Every act of living well was, in its own way, an act of resistance. The 1920s were a time of technological wonder for America as a whole. Radios bringing voices and music into living rooms. Electric streetcars making cities more connected. Telephones ringing with new possibilities. But these wonders often reached black communities last. If you were black in 1920s America, you lived with the knowledge that what the nation called progress might not include you. And still, people pressed forward. Black mechanics fixed engines in small garages. Black teachers lit sparks in young minds. Black nurses stayed awake through long nights caring for the sick. And black musicians transformed pain into beauty. Life in the 1920s for black Americans was a constant balancing act between hope and harsh reality, between the dream of what America could be and the truth of what it was. But it was also a decade that planted seeds. Seeds of cultural pride that would later blossom into the civil rights movement. Seeds of migration that would reshape the nation's cities. Seeds of courage in the face of injustice, watered by the sweat and sacrifice of those who refused to be erased. The summer of 1921 brought one of the darkest chapters in American history. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district stood as a shining example of what black prosperity could look like. Elegant brick buildings lined the streets, filled with law offices, grocery stores, cafes, and theaters owned and run by black men and women who had built their wealth from the ground up. They called it Black Wall Street. But over the course of 2 days, white mobs stormed into Greenwood, burning more than 1,000 homes and businesses to the ground. Planes even flew overhead, dropping incendiary devices, an act of domestic terrorism rarely acknowledged in history books. By the time the smoke cleared, the neighborhood lay in ashes, and hundreds of black residents were dead or missing. Survivors spoke of being marched at gunpoint into internment camps. The message was not subtle. In America, even success could be a dangerous thing if you were black, and yet, from those ashes, some returned to rebuild. They patched walls, reopened stores, and carried on. That determination was a quiet rebellion against a system that wanted them broken. This was the spirit of the 1920s black experience, a refusal to let hatred have the final word in rural America. Life moved at a slower pace, but was no less shaped by struggle. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, the tobacco farms of North Carolina, and the rice plantations of Arkansas, black families labored from sunrise to sunset. Many still worked under sharecropping contracts, where the debt was designed to never be repaid. Each year's harvest was swallowed by the landlord's fees, leaving families trapped in cycles of poverty. Trains and buses heading north passed through these small towns like whispers of another life, a life with factory wages, city lights, and a chance to breathe freer air in those same small towns. Schoolhouses for black children stood on the margins, both literally and figuratively, often built from donated wood, with pot-belly stoves for heat. They lacked libraries, laboratories, and playgrounds. Still, the lessons taught there carried power. Teachers, often young women barely out of high school themselves, saw their work as a mission. They taught reading, not just as a skill, but as a shield, because a mind that could read could also question, and a questioning mind was dangerous to those who wanted submission. Transportation in the South carried its own dangers. Segregated train cars were poorly maintained, and long-distance travel for black families required meticulous planning. One needed to know where it was safe to stop for food or fuel, which towns to avoid entirely, and how to keep one's head down if a police officer approached. Even a short trip to the city might mean passing through places where sundown town signs warned black travelers to be gone before nightfall. The open road was both an invitation and a threat. In the cities, the streets told a different story. Chicago's South Side was a tapestry of black-owned businesses, churches, and social clubs. Jazz clubs lit up the night, and Sunday parades brought neighbors together in their finest clothes. Detroit's auto factories offered steady wages to some, but always with the unspoken rule that black workers would be the first fired when times got hard. Hospitals remained largely segregated. Black patients were often sent to underfunded wards, and black doctors were denied staff privileges at white institutions. So, they built their own. Places like Providence Hospital in Chicago, where black doctors trained the next generation and treated their community with respect they couldn't find elsewhere. Electricity was reshaping the American home. Radio sets became the centerpiece of many living rooms, but in black neighborhoods, they were often shared luxuries, with neighbors gathering to listen together. Streetcars clanged through the cities, making movement easier, but even here, the color line was drawn. A black passenger could ride, but not always where they chose. And if trouble came if a white passenger complained, there was little hope of justice. Still, culture flourished. In New Orleans, the brass bands rolled down the streets, carrying rhythms born from African drumming and gospel hymns. In Harlem, poets like Countee Cullen and Zora Neale Hurston crafted words that lifted the ordinary into the extraordinary. Black newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender, not only reported the news, but served as lifelines, sharing job postings, migration advice, and stories of achievement that countered the constant negative portrayals in wide-toned press. Every performance, every printed word, every painted canvas was an act of self, but discrimination was never far from reach. The Ku Klux Klan, emboldened and organized, marched openly through northern and southern cities alike, not only targeting black Americans, but also immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. Their rallies drew crowds, and their influence seeped into politics and law enforcement. Lynching, though less frequent than in the decades before, still claimed lives each one, a grim warning meant to terrify entire communities. The federal government turned a blind eye. Anti-lynching bills died in Congress again and again, and yet there were moments of triumph. Black entrepreneurs founded insurance companies, banks, and publishing houses. Black athletes broke barriers in boxing and baseball's Negro leagues, filling stadiums with cheering fans. In Washington, D.C., Howard University trained lawyers and scholars who would one day challenge segregation in court. The resilience of Black America in the 1920s was not just about survival, it was about laying a foundation. At home, life carried its small joys. Children skipped rope in alleyways. Men gathered on stoops to play dominoes. Women shared recipes over backyard fences. On Saturday nights, neighbors filled dance halls, letting music carry them for a few hours away from the grind of the week. On Sunday mornings, church bells called them to worship, the pews filling with voices singing of a faith that sustained them through generations of trials. Community was both a shield and a source of power. By the end of the decade, America was on the edge of change. The stock market crash of 1929 would bring the Great Depression, altering the landscape of opportunity for everyone but especially for Black Americans, who would once again find themselves among the first to feel the pain and the last to receive relief. Still, the 1920s had left a mark. The Great Migration had transformed the demographics of the nation's cities. The Harlem Renaissance had planted cultural seeds that would influence art and music for decades. Black newspapers had built networks of information that stretched from coast to coast, and the children who sat in those underfunded classrooms would grow up to march, speak, and demand the rights their parents had been denied. Looking back, the 1920s for Black America were a paradox, an era of breathtaking creativity and crushing injustice, of bold steps forward and brutal reminders of the past. To walk through that decade as a Black man or woman was to live in two Americas, one that praised the nation's progress and another that denied your place in it. But to live through it was also to understand the meaning of perseverance. It was to believe, against all odds, that one's dignity was not negotiable. And that is the truth of what really happened to Black Americans in the 1920s. They endured, they built, they dreamed, they buried, they're dead and still danced. They carried the weight of a country that often turned its back, and in doing so, they carried the torch that would one day light the way to a more just America.